Welcome to my presentation. My name is Brenda Zoderer. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Institute of Landscape Development, Recreation and Conservation Planning at Boca University of Vienna. In this presentation I'm going to present you a recent piece of work on which I've been working together with my colleagues. It's part of a research project where we looked at the different public representations of wilderness that exists, and in particular we developed a methodological approach to first identify these representations and then to translate them into maps to visualize their geographic coverage. So in this presentation I'm going to present you this methodological approach and also show you some of the results of the study. Well, the study is embedded within a wider debate of wilderness in Europe. This debate is still quite a young one. It's mainly led by nature conservationists, and key features which we can observe characterize these debates around wilderness is that wilderness is typically understood as an objective reality, as something which is out there and can be measured and defined by experts. So following the European Parliament's resolution on wilderness, which was adopted in 2009, experts, NGOs which were involved in formulating the resolution, they also now proposed a standardized wilderness definition. And based on this wilderness definition, wild areas were now identified and mapped for the entire area of Europe, basically using 4 specific spatial criteria, which comprise the naturalness of a place, the human impact, the remoteness and ruggedness of an area. So in short, we can see that there's a tendency that wilderness should be defined by experts and also mapped and identified using one single map. This is somewhat in contrast to the famous saying of the environmental historian Roderick Nash. Nash once said that one man's wilderness is another's roadside picnic ground. So with this quote, he wanted to emphasize the subjective nature of the wilderness concept, and he particularly highlighted that different people might have a different understanding of the same phenomena. And so also, if we look at philosophical debates around wilderness, it's quite established and widely acknowledged that wilderness is an idea. So different people might have different ideas of wilderness depending on their social cultural background or also their personal experience. So it's really difficult to come up with one agreed biophysical reality of wilderness, and rather we can say that wilderness exists in different places, in different environments, depending on how people define it. So for instance, for some people, wilderness might be in this shopping basket, overgrown shopping basket. For others, it's rather a remote area, as shown in the picture on the right side, which is located in the Alps, for instance. So motivated by these debates, especially by the philosophical one, we understand wilderness as any place that is considered to be wilderness. So we were particularly interested in asking what is wilderness for people and where it can be found. And by doing so, we specifically looked at the mental representations that people hold of wilderness. So mental representations are a form of subjective knowledge that people construct, use to make sense of the world in which they live, also which they experience. So these constructs, mental representations, we call them fuzzy categories. Fuzzy because they are comprised of more or less correlated descriptive attributes. So in this study, we were particularly interested in identifying these mental representations, but also to identify the attributes that characterize them. So this largely or essentially comprised the first research objective, which guided us through this research. So the first one, as I already said, was to identify public representations of wilderness, understanding them as, or referring to them as mental representations. And in the second step, we aim to translate these public wilderness representations, so translate them into maps to visualize the geographic coverage. And then in a third step, we compared our approach focusing on the public representations with a standardized expert-based approach to wilderness quality mapping. So this is essentially the one which represents the dominant European view I've introduced in the beginning, which maps wilderness according to these 4 specific spatial criteria and based on the existing standardized and expert-based, expert-informed wilderness definition that exists in Europe at the moment. So, well, the study was carried out in the region of South Tyrol, which is a mountain region located in the very north of Italy, just across the border of Austria and Switzerland. It's characterized by a very diverse topography, so there are mountains of up to 4,000 meters, deep valleys in between. Also the landscape is highly diverse. It's quite known, it's a very popular tourist destination, so it belongs to one of the 5% of most popular destinations for tourists across Europe. To address our research objectives, we used a multi-methodological approach, which is comprised of 2 major steps. So one is, on one hand, we use an explorative mixed method approach to identify public wilderness representations, and on the other hand, we combined this with a GS-based approach to translate these understandings or these representations into maps. So the first step, we conducted semi-structured interviews with local inhabitants of the region, but also visitors coming to the region, mainly to identify the key attributes people mention most often to describe their representation of wilderness. So we identified these attributes and used the most frequent ones in a questionnaire survey. This questionnaire survey was then used to ask a larger sample of people and also to identify a limited number of public wilderness representations, those that are most dominant, most often shared by people. And in the third step, we then translated these into maps using GIS-based models, and compared these then with a standardized wilderness mapping approach, which you can see on the bottom line. The results of the interviews show that it's really diverse, so different expressions came up mentioned by people to describe wilderness. So there was quite some chaos, and we wanted to order this chaos, and so we used attributes that were mentioned by people most often in the questionnaire survey. The questionnaire survey showed us that indeed we can bring some order in this chaos, in the sense that using a PCA, a principal component analysis, allowed us to identify a limited number of public wilderness representations. We identified exactly 3 ones, which are those that were intersubjectively shared by people, so mentioned most often, and we could identify them across our sample more often than others. So each of these wilderness representations was characterized by a very specific mix of attributes. So for instance, you can see here wilderness representation 1, which we named an area with no human impact, is characterized by a very rigorous definition of attributes. So people defined it as an inaccessible area, as an area where no human activities have ever been taken out. It's a place which have not changed by humans yet. No settlements, no human infrastructure is visible. This is in contrast to another understanding, wilderness representation 2, which is understood as a remote and large area characterized by low visitor densities. It's also considered to be a habitat for wildlife. And again, this differs from a third wilderness representation, which is defined by more moderate as a more moderate understanding of wilderness. It's largely an area where nature can develop and no settlements exist. Well, so based on these wilderness representations, we wanted to translate them into spatial terms. We did this by identifying appropriate spatial indicators for each of the wilderness attributes that characterize one wilderness representation, and we combined them in and weighted them within a multi-criteria evaluation model. So just to show you, here on the left side you can see some of the maps showing the spatial variation of each attribute across the study. And for each of these 3 wilderness representations, we picked up those that characterize them, picked up these maps and combined them together to within such a multi-criteria evaluation model to come up with one map per wilderness attribute. So this then resulted in 3 maps that were produced, each of them differing in terms of the spatial distribution, location, and the extent of high wilderness quality. So each of them shows wilderness along a gradient, but you can see that the location of where wilderness with high quality can be expected according to such an understanding is quite different. The final step, then we compared this with an expert-based approach, as I told you already in the beginning. It's basically the one, so we followed a publication of Radford and colleagues, which was published in 2009. So it's a standardized approach which well represents the current dominant view in Europe. It's an approach which maps wilderness according to 4 wilderness attributes, which are the ruggedness, the remoteness, naturalness of a place, and the human impact. Again, if we compare this expert-based wilderness map with the other 3 public defined wilderness quality maps, we can see that the one based on expert knowledge is quite different. So according to experts, a larger area of the study region is attributed with high wilderness quality values. So if we overlay them, we can see that in certain areas we can expect a higher wilderness conflict potential because there's more disagreement between the single wilderness representations. And interestingly, most conflict potential could be localized in the east of the study site, which is the UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Dolomites. This site was considered to be wild for some, but for others it wasn't wild at all. To conclude, we can say that individuals' wilderness representation is really diverse, But in the study, we could also show that it's possible to limit this diversity to 3 dominant public wilderness representations. And this is in contrast with the common assumption that wilderness representations might be endless and therefore can't be considered in landscape planning and management. And so by identifying these 3 dominant public wilderness representations, we could provide a manageable information base that should be considered in planning, landscape planning and management in the future. So especially it shows that the current European focus on expert-based approaches to wilderness risks to miss out these public representations and thereby marginalize other views that are often held by less powerful public groups which don't have a saying in planning and management. The approach I've shown you also helps to localize and resolve wilderness conflicts, so we can see where these conflicts can be expected, but also uncover some of the reasons. So often conflicts are interpreted as a result of different values and attitudes that are attributed to wilderness. I hope that this presentation also showed you that it's not all about values, but it's also about different representations that people might have of the same phenomena, in that case of wilderness. Well, thank you very much for listening. I hope that this study will be published by the time the conference is taking place. I thank you, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. Just drop me an email and I hope I can answer them. Thank you.